Are some of Russia's nuclear weapons in Belarus, near Ukraine's doorstep? And if the answer is yes, does that mean Putin has taken his nuclear saber rattling to the next level? It is the Russian president himself who made this claim, stating that this summer Russia moved some of its short-range nuclear weapons into Belarus. That would mean closer to Ukraine and practically to NATO's doorstep. This declared deployment of Russian weapons on the territory of its neighbor and loyal ally, Belarus, marks a new stage in the Kremlin's nuclear saber rattling over its invasion of Ukraine, and yet another bid to deter the West from increasing its military support to Kyiv. Neither Putin nor his Belarusian counterpart, Alexander Lukashenko, have stated how many Russian weapons were actually moved. All they have said is that Soviet-era facilities were in fact being readied in Belarus to accommodate these Russian weapons, and Belarusian pilots and missile crews were trained to use them. The US and NATO haven't confirmed this move. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has denounced Moscow's rhetoric as dangerous and reckless, but said earlier this month that they had not seen any change in Russia's nuclear posture. While some experts doubt the claims by Putin and Lukashenko, others are of the opinion that Western intelligence might actually be unable to monitor such movement. However, earlier this month, CNN quoted US intelligence officials as saying they had no reason to doubt Putin's claim about the delivery of the first batch of the weapons to Belarus, and that it could be challenging for the United States to actually track these. Unlike nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles that can destroy entire cities, tactical nuclear weapons for use against troops on the battlefield can have an yield as small as 1 kiloton. The US bomb in Hiroshima during World War II was 15 kilotons. The devices are compact, used on bombs, missiles and artillery shells. They could be discreetly carried on a truck or a plane. These weapons use containers that emit no radiation and could have been flown into Belarus without Western intelligence actually seeing it. That is what some military analysts believe. Belarus has 25 underground facilities built during the Cold War for nuclear-tipped intermediate-range missiles that can withstand missile attacks. Only 5 or 6 such depots could actually store tactical nuclear weapons, but the military operates at all the depots, essentially to mislead Western intelligence. Remember, quite early on in his war against Ukraine, Putin had quite brazenly referred to his nuclear arsenal when he vowed on multiple occasions to use all means necessary to protect Russia. He has toned down his statements of late, but a top lieutenant in the Russian military continues to dangle the nuclear threat. Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, who served as a placeholder president from 2008 to 2012 when Putin was term limited, unleashes nuclear threats on a daily basis, claiming that Moscow will not hesitate to use nuclear weapons. In a recent article, Medvedev said, and I quote, "The apocalypse isn't just possible, but quite likely, and the only way to avoid it is to bow to Russian demands." He wrote, "The world faces a confrontation far worse than the one witnessed during the Cuban Missile Crisis because our enemies have decided to really defeat Russia, the largest nuclear power in the world." Many Western observers dismiss this as bluster. Putin seems to have dialed down his nuclear rhetoric after getting signals to do so from China. Some observers say the evident Chinese displeasure did have an effect and may have been accompanied by private messaging to Russia in this regard. Moscow's defense doctrine envisages a nuclear response to an atomic strike or even an attack with conventional weapons that threaten the very existence of the Russian state. That vague wording has led some Russian experts to urge the Kremlin to spell out those conditions in more detail and force the West to take the warnings more seriously. Dmitry Trenin, who headed the Moscow Carnegie Center for 14 years, says the possibility of using nuclear weapons in the current conflict must not be concealed. The real, not theoretical perspective of it should create stimuli for stopping the escalation of the war and eventually set the stage for a strategic balance in Europe that would be acceptable to us. He goes on to say, Western belief that Putin is bluffing about using nuclear weapons is an extremely dangerous delusion. Sergei Karaganov, a top Russian foreign affairs expert who advises Putin's Security Council, has said, Moscow should make its nuclear threats more specific in order to break the will of the West and force it to stop supporting Ukraine as it seeks to reclaim Russian-held areas in a grinding counter-offensive. In his words, it's necessary to restore the fear of nuclear escalation, otherwise mankind is doomed, suggesting that Russia establish a ladder of accelerating actions. According to him, deploying nuclear weapons in Belarus is the first step, with perhaps a follow-up of warning ethnic Russians in countries supporting Ukraine to evacuate areas near facilities that could be nuclear targets. If that doesn't work, Karaganov suggests, there should be a Russian nuclear strike on Poland, because he believes that the United States wouldn't dare respond in kind to protect a NATO ally for fear of igniting a world war. Sergei Karaganov says, if we build the right strategy of intimidation and even the use of it, the risk of a retaliatory nuclear or any other strike on our territory could be reduced to a minimum. Only if a madman who hates his own country sits in the White House would America risk launching a strike in defense of the Europeans and draw a response sacrificing Boston for Poznan. That's what he says. While pro-Kremlin analysts have floated such scenarios, Lukashenko, the Belarusian president, says hosting Russian nuclear weapons in his country is meant to deter aggression by Poland. He claimed a number of nuclear weapons were flown to Belarus without Western intelligence noticing, with the rest coming later this year. Officials in Moscow and Minsk said the warheads could be carried by Belarusian Su-25 ground attack jets or fitted to short-range Iskander missiles. However, there are those who argue that this deployment is about cementing Putin's control over Belarus and does not actually offer Moscow any military advantage over placing them in Russia's Baltic exclave of Kaliningrad that borders Poland and Lithuania. They say the West should recognize this as a ploy that has far more to do with Russia's ambitions for Belarus than any genuine impact on European security. Some observers question whether the deployment to Belarus has even taken place. Others note that Russia could have deployed these weapons without adhering to protocols used in the 1990s when Moscow wanted to show the West that its nuclear arsenal was secure amid economic and political turmoil. Belarusian military analyst Valery Karbolevich says keeping such details secret could be a Kremlin strategy of applying permanent pressure and blackmailing Ukraine and the West. The unknown scares more than certainty. Some also argue that the United States and NATO may play down the deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus because they pose a threat that the West finds difficult to counter. Others say if Putin decides to use nuclear weapons, he may do it from Belarus in the hope that a Western response would target Belarus instead of Russia. The political opposition to Lukashenko has in fact warned that such a deployment turns Belarus into a hostage of the Kremlin. So just what is Putin's game plan here? Is this nuclear saber-rattling reaching the next level? Time for us to take a quick break here on Global Lens. Don't go anywhere, there's more on the other side.